So far in this mini-series, we've looked at three of the nation's largest states, as well as my current and quickly growing state of South Carolina. I've lived in three of these states and had plenty to talk about with their large populations and cities, and very little information exists about them within the established Fallout lore. However, there are a handful of states that have not even been mentioned at all, aside from potentially knowing what Commonwealth they were supposed to be located in, so I figured it was finally time to cover a state that has never really even been mentioned at all in the Fallout series. Not only that, it is one of the smallest and least populated states in the country, and quite possibly one of the safest states on the East Coast. Today, we're taking a look at Vermont. So first off, Vermont is located in the Commonwealth of New England in the very far northeastern part of the United States. This is the same Commonwealth that Massachusetts is located in, along with Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine. So we have actually been in this particular Commonwealth before. As with all the previous videos in this series, we're going to assume a total United States population of about 400 million by the time of the Great War in 2077. We're also still assuming a 20 to 21% growth rate over the 2020 census statistics. Per the 2020 census, Vermont only had a population of 643,077 people, which would increase to about 778,000 by 2077. Yep, only a little over 750,000 people. That's actually smaller than several of the cities I've discussed so far in this series. Now, as always, the first targets in a nuclear strike are likely to be military installations. Well, as it turns out, Vermont doesn't actually have any major military bases, which was, I guess, not that surprising, but I was expecting maybe a little bit more than what I found. In the case of Vermont, all I could really find were National Guard installations and training facilities, so here's a quick rundown on what I was able to find for the region. There's Coast Guard Station Burlington. It's on the coast of Lake Champlain, but back in 2009 it only had 25 people on staff, so it might be more now, but I imagine it's still below 50. Then there's Camp Ethan Allen, which is home to the Army Mountain Warfare School and a small airfield that was used back during the World Wars and could potentially be brought back into use in an emergency or total war scenario. Then there's Patrick Leahy, I probably butchered that name horribly, Burlington International Airport. It's by far the largest airport in Vermont, and it's in joint use by the military and civilians. It's also the home of the Vermont Air National Guard. Finally, there's Camp Johnson, the headquarters for the Vermont Army National Guard. It houses over 15,000 total people, including about 3,000 soldiers, or National Guardsmen. Needless to say, from a military standpoint, Vermont would be pretty low on the list as a nuclear target. Now, one really interesting point about all of these facilities, though, is that they are all located in the exact same county, that being the most populous county of Chittenden. Once again, I hope I didn't butcher that name. Now, I guess it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that the enemy might drop one mid to large-sized nuke in the middle of the county and try to hit everything all at once. So now let's take a look at some civilian targets. Contrary to what some people might believe, Vermont is actually a very rural state overall. The state only has 11 cities that have populations over 10,000 people, and 7 of them are in Chittenden County. Furthermore, the state's economy is pretty heavily service-based, along with a fairly big focus on government, tourism, real estate, some healthcare, and some small businesses. A lot of small businesses, for that matter. There historically was a large agricultural sector, and while it's shrunk a bit over the last few decades, there's still a lot of focus on dairy and apple production, and the state actually leads the nation in the production of maple syrup. In terms of manufacturing capabilities, it's there, but in much smaller numbers than the other states we've looked at. Its biggest manufacturing focus is on aircraft and airplane parts, as well as some small-scale production of furniture, medical supplies, and other miscellaneous items. For civilian targets, I guess you could see the city of Burlington being a potential target. Its 2020 population was a whopping 44,743. The second and third most populous cities, which are South Burlington and Colchester, are located very close to Burlington and contained a total of 37,816 people in 2020. Those three cities would have a combined population of around 100,000 by 2077, which would be about an eighth of the state's whole population. These three cities and towns do contain several colleges. They contain the Patrick Leahy Airport, again I apologize if I butchered that, the state's largest hospital, and a few manufacturers. Furthermore, all of the state's military facilities are within 30 miles of the city. Now, in a real-world nuclear war scenario, there's a high chance Vermont doesn't even get hit at all. According to the FEMA target map, it might get hit one time in a 500 or even 2,000 nuke scenario. However, we know that in the Fallout universe, a lot more bombs were used, and a lot of them were much smaller than anything we have in the real world. I think it would be fair to assume that the Burlington area might get hit by a few small bombs or maybe even just one giant bomb, and that the Chittenden County would take the brunt of the attack on Vermont. Another potential target is Montpelier, the state capital. The capital's permanent population was only 8,074 in 2020, so the 2077 population would be just under 10,000. It is another tourism and small business driven town, though being the state capital, it also houses the Vermont state government. It also contains the headquarters for National Life Group, which is some kind of large life insurance company out here in the real world. In the Fallout universe, I think it's reasonable to expect it might get hit by a bomb, but probably like a smaller one. Rutland is the fourth largest city or town in Vermont, and its 2077 population would be around 19,100. It's mostly small business focused with a bit of manufacturing and contains the state's second largest hospital. Then there's Bennington, which is the fifth largest city. Its 2077 population would be about 18,500. Along with healthcare, government, tourism, and small businesses like many of the other towns and cities, it does have a fair bit of focus on agriculture, forestry, fishing, and just a little bit of manufacturing. Other large cities, well, large by Vermont standards, and towns like Brattleboro, Hartford, and Williston don't really offer any targets of interest that I can see. Then there's Essex, Milton, and Essex Junction. The latter of those does have a large semiconductor plant, so I could see that potentially being a minor target, though it would probably just get caught up in the other Chittenden County explosions anyway. Maybe Springfield, which has a little bit of manufacturing, or Newport, which manufactures military helmets and has some healthcare employment. They might get hit by a small bomb, but I don't think it's particularly likely. So now that we've really covered all of the potential targets, what would Vermont look like in terms of creatures, factions, etc.? You probably see a lot of the same mutated creatures that we see in Fallout 4 and 76, including rad rats, possums, Yao-guai, and other small game. But I suspect you'd also see some kind of mutated coyote, along with bobcats, which can already actually be pretty dangerous out here in the real world. And probably some kind of giant mutated moose monster, because mooses are apparently a thing up there. For factions, I assume that the major factions that we know from the Fallout series probably wouldn't really be present in Vermont, mostly because it's such a low population with low manufacturing capability. It probably wouldn't be considered a critical state to move into to rebuild by these different factions, especially with its very cold climate. Maybe they would consider recolonizing the area for the purpose of growing food there, but honestly, I think it would just probably end up being occupied by a lot of small groups of survivors and other, real small regional powers and such. I guess it's also possible maybe a few synths managed to make their way there from the Commonwealth, though who knows. I'm sure there would be some groups of raiders and desperate survivors from other states, but any well-defended and well-connected groups of survivors within Vermont should be able to fight them off. I'd honestly probably be a little bit more worried about the mutated creatures and the potential desperate refugees immediately after the bombs went off. Now, for a new segment here, I want to take a quick look at some possible cryptid enemies now that they've become kind of a mainstay of the series with Fallout 76. For one, I'm sure this would be a perfect place for them to finally introduce Bigfoot into a Fallout game. Definitely seems like the kind of place you'd want to hang out at. Then we have Champ, the monster of Lake Champlain. It is said to be a nearly 200-foot-long monster, black and serpentine, though it is not known to be hostile towards humans. Now just imagine it growing to about 4 times its normal size and shooting some sort of radioactive or acidic water at any survivors near the lake. Then there's the Pigmen of Northfield. It's basically man-bear-pig, but only half man and half pig, no half bear. Just imagine, I guess this is where Al Gore goes to in the apocalypse so he can finally become half man, half bear, half pig, but without the bear part. Finally, we have a little region known as the Bennington Triangle in the central part of the state. Apparently, several people went missing without a trace in this region back in the 1940s, and it's suspected that something called the Bennington Monster could have been responsible. It's possibly connected to the legends of the Wendigo from what I've read, and it's been described as being part cat, part reptile, and having wings, so I guess it's some kind of weird demented combination of a Scorch Beast and a Wendigo from Fallout 76. Finally, how about some vault information? There is exactly one vault in Vermont. It's somewhere around the towns of Proctor and Rutland. Now, initially, this location might not make a lot of sense given that that's not a very populous area and it wouldn't be able to potentially save as many people. But when you really look at it, it actually does make a lot of sense because they stuck it in an area that's not very likely to get hit. And we know that vault safety standards weren't exactly top-notch. They were made by the lowest bidder on junk funds. So they probably knew that the vault couldn't survive a direct impact from a nuclear bomb. Therefore, putting it sort of further away would make sense if they actually wanted to keep the population inside alive. So I'm kind of going out on a limb here and saying that this vault either had some sort of really mild experiment, maybe something like how long can humans only survive on maple syrup, or it very easily could have been one of the handful of control vaults. It would make sense for the region. They could have a Gek in there that would be great for rebuilding the wasteland outside, and then eventually maybe the Enclave comes like 200 years later and takes it over and captures all the humans or kills them, and things just go badly from there. So ultimately, how does Vermont fare in the aftermath of the Great War? I actually kind of want to look at two different scenarios this time. First, I want to take a look at the worst case scenario. I don't think this one's particularly likely. It's definitely not accurate to a real world scenario, but it could at least make the state somewhat interesting to explore in the Fallout universe. In a worst case scenario, Burlington and the surrounding area gets absolutely obliterated by a 500 kiloton nuke, and a few of the other larger cities and towns just get hit by smaller nukes of no more than about 50 kilotons. I know that supposedly all the bombs were somewhere between 200 and 750 kilotons according to the original Fallout, but we know from the Fallout TV series that at least some of the bombs were really, really small, potentially less than 10 kilotons. So I think it's fair to assume that most of the larger bombs are going to be saved for the larger, more critical targets, not Vermont. Therefore, Vermont would lose 10 to 20% of the population immediately, and probably quite a bit more in the immediate aftermath the first few weeks after the bombs go off. However, I think that a more realistic scenario is that Vermont is mostly ignored during the Great War. I think a couple of large bombs might drop on Burlington or just the Chittenden County area of the state, and probably a smaller one right on top of the state capital of Montpelier. Interestingly, though, this scenario only results in about a tenth of the state's population being killed, and less than 20% of the state's population even being casualties at all. Of course, that's only in the very immediate days after the war, and there is more to talk about with that, but in terms of the actual blasts, it's not going to kill that much of the population. Another reason I stated that Vermont might be one of the safest states, at least on the East Coast, involves this surrounding area. Connecticut is too far to the south, as is Rhode Island, and the jet stream should carry a lot of the fallout from western Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island into New Hampshire and Maine and just away from Vermont. I haven't analyzed New York yet, and I don't plan to do so for Massachusetts, given we've already seen the Commonwealth in Fallout 4. But on my initial look, the only two places I can see where some radiation might carry into Vermont are Pittsfield in Massachusetts and Albany in New York, which I think actually probably would be hit in this scenario. But it's really only dangerous to Vermont if that city gets hit by at least a 250 kiloton nuke. If it's something smaller, it's not really going to affect Vermont at all. Now, less than 20% of the population would die from the bombs and in the very immediate first couple of weeks after the Great War, but Vermont's survival would still present some other challenges. It is one of the coldest states in the country, receiving 60 to 100 inches of snowfall per year, and its average temperature is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius for about 7 months out of the year. Now, to a southerner like myself, that's pretty damn cold, and it's actually consistently colder than Ohio. For those who don't know, I lived in Cincinnati for a year, and I thought even that cold was unbearable, so I would not do well in Vermont. Couple that with the whole nuclear winter that would happen, especially during the first couple years, and you may very well be lucky to have 3 months that are sunny enough and warm enough to potentially grow something. Even despite all of this, though, Vermont should still fare pretty well compared to a lot of states. Even with only 3 months of time to grow food, you have to factor in the state's much smaller population and very low population density. Any of the small and medium-sized communities that are mostly found in the southern two-thirds of the state should be able to grow, forage, and hunt enough food to get through the first winter. That's provided the mutated animals and potential raiders or invaders from other states don't overwhelm all of the settlements. There's plenty of trees that can be harvested for wood, so you can potentially build something like log cabins, or at least have wood fires to heat yourself if you can get some kind of structure together. You could also easily create some sort of ice house type structure all over the state, and you could use those to preserve your food throughout the year without modern refrigeration. And there should be enough non-irradiated land to provide the necessary resources for up to 80% of the population to survive, at least after those first couple of weeks. In terms of electricity, Vermont actually consumes more than it produces, but everything it does produce is actually renewable, so they might even be able to get some power back online pretty quickly, which would be a huge advantage in this wasteland. I feel like water would actually be one of the more problematic issues in Vermont, as I wouldn't want to just risk eating all of the potentially irradiated snow that would fall throughout the year. So survivors would probably have to migrate toward the western side of the state with Lake Champlain and the rivers that lead south from there, or they'd have to make some kind of filter that could get the radiation out of the snow and then melt and boil the snow. Additionally, until pretty recently in the real world, Vermont had a pretty strong gun culture and relatively relaxed laws compared to states like Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So the state would probably have enough armed survivors and weaponry to fight off attackers from other states as well as mutated creatures, at least from those few states. That is all until they get taken over by some random coalition of people from New Hampshire and Maine that have even less stringent laws, so we would have to see how it plays out in the long run. In the end, I think you could potentially see a good 60% of the population survive the first year. I think it's fair to assume about 20% would be dead just due to the bombs and the subsequent radiation and everything from the first couple weeks after the Great War, and then another 20% or so from lack of food, water, shelter, medicine, and other violence. So overall, Vermont fares a lot better than any of the other states we've really talked about. Just no major cities, mostly rural, small population. I think it would fare pretty well, and I think it would be a good place to consider trying to survive in within the Fallout universe. I know that with, I believe it was Fallout Van Buren, there was initially going to be some sort of attempt at making survival elements within the snow, within freezing cold weather. And I think that would be a really interesting way to go with the series, because then you'd have to start worrying about other things like heat. So it would give you new sort of survival elements, and that could play very well in a state like Vermont. Thank y'all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I hope you'll leave a like, subscribe, ring the bell so you never miss a future upload. Let me know down in the comments what you think about Vermont's chances of surviving the Great War, or if you're from there or currently live there. But next time, we will be looking at a state that could generate a brand new and horrific type of cryptid, the radiation-charged Florida Man.